EGM Network.
All right, here we go. 75. That's 75. 75.
Broadcasting from the golden shores of Vero Beach, Florida, this is the Vero Beach Auction Podcast with your host, David Kratzer.
Hi, and thank you for joining us today. My name is David Kratzer with Vero Beach Auction. I have a very special guest, Jim Oelschlager, who is a Highwayman collector and historian.
Glad to be here, David.
Thanks for joining me. And we're going to be talking about one of my favorite things that we have in the auction, and I've been really excited to be involved with, is the Highwayman art and the Highwayman story. And in bringing Jim in today, Jim's been really instrumental in putting together a timeline, which has been incredible with information, history of the artists. There's been a lot of stuff out there that Jim's been compiling and putting together. And, you know, the story of the Highwaymen really is fascinating, especially in all the years that they've been painting and getting their stories out there. So the first thing that I thought we'd kind of start with is with the Highwayman story. I mean, the artists were there, obviously, but there's been a lot of early supporters and contributors to the Highwayman story. We know Gary Monroe, obviously. Catherine Enns wrote some of the books about the Highwaymen. But three very important names, Jeff Klinkenberg.
Correct.
And he was involved with the St. Petersburg Times. And I think he had probably the first articles.
It was the first article on the Highwaymen. It was August 5th of 1995, and that one was about Jim Fitch. And then a week later, he came out with one with highlighting Robert Butler. And the first one, I looked up the circulation numbers. It was a Sunday edition, so it was about 450,000 Floridians got to read about the Highwayman's story. And it really, I asked Mr. Fitch about this, and he said that there's no doubt that the Klinkenberg articles lit the match for the Highwaymen, in his opinion.
Yeah.
After that article came out, I mentioned to you at lunch that University Press, which eventually did the first Highwayman book with Gary Monroe writing it, they approached Mr. Fitch and said, hey, this is a sensational story. We'd really like to get it. If you and a colleague, suggesting probably Mr. Klinkenberg, would be interested, we'd love to get a manuscript to review on the topic of the Highwaymen. Mr. Fitch at that time had started the museum, didn't really have time to do it, and he turned down the offer. So the project sat until Gary picked it up in 1998, I believe.
Mm-hmm. Do you know how Klinkenberg got involved with the Highwaymen?
I think Mr. Fitch had written an article in 94 naming the Highwaymen.
That's right. That was the first start of it. Yep.
And then 95, the Antique and Arts around Florida published an article on the Highwaymen. Mm-hmm. That had more circulation than probably the first one that Jim wrote. So I think Mr. Klinkenberg had heard about it from the 1995 article that came out in the winter of 1995.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's funny with the newspaper, like I remember even advertising classifieds and all that. So it was like, that was really the way to do it. And even as that has transitioned so much into nowadays, even doing a podcast, now we're talking about things that were in the newspaper articles and back then. And, so for Jim Fitch and Klinkenberg to be involved, and another name that was early on in the 90s, Dave Folds was a big collector and dealer in the Highwayman art.
He was. Dave Folds got involved early. His dad had a real estate company in West Palm. Mm-hmm. So he was buying from Alfred and the other artists in the 60s. And then Dave in the 80s opened up a secondhand store down in the West Palm area and put Highwayman paintings in there.
Oh, yeah.
He eventually became Dixie Folk Art, and he was at the Piccadilly's in West Palm with Bob LeBlanc and John Phillips. Mm-hmm. So those were the three early dealers at the time.
Yeah, real estate and the realtors were a big part of the Highwayman story, right? Selling houses and
absolutely
filling them with paintings, yeah. and even now they're building so many houses. I was just out west in Vero, and they're building a massive neighborhood out there. So we expect growth in Florida as it'll continue. Hopefully this year we don't have too many hurricanes. We always worry about that. But as the Florida market grows and the population grows, what really speaks to volumes to Floridians is this Highwayman story and artwork. One of my customers, his dad was a realtor, And he said he knew James Gibson very well. And he said, so when he would sell a house, he would give the new homeowners a Highwayman painting as a gift. As Highwayman. So that's pretty cool how Dave Folds, dad was involved with the real estate and stuff.
Absolutely. It was a good gift. If the audience is interested, there is a large Harold Newton. I think it's one of the largest ones that you can see at a public facility. It's at the St. Lucie History Museum. They have a large, I think it's over 6 feet by 6 feet, Harold Newton. That painting was gifted from the Mackle brothers, the builders, to the city of Fort Pierce when they started, developing St. Lucie County. So I found an article in 1958 where the Mackle brothers gifted to the city. It was a big event. It's just nice that it's in a museum that people can see it. It's a beautiful, a heavy palette knife, obviously, painting.
We love the large Highwaymen. You don't get the chance to see too many of them, especially what we consider jumbo, right? Jumbo would be larger than our normal, like a 24-48 is our sofa size. But anything larger than that, we consider our jumbo paintings. I'm not sure who even trademarked that jumbo.
I don't know, probably the dealers.
Yeah, jumbo, right?
Fort Pierce Community College, by the way, has a 4x8 Sam Newton that he painted for the school.
Yeah, that's cool.
Yeah, it's in the admissions building down there.
Yeah, I guess those must have been, the larger ones must have been commissioned when they're that large.
Yeah, certainly.
Yeah. I had a woman one time I spoke with that had a really big Harold, an inlet scene, and I think it was like 5 feet wide or something. I remember her sending me a picture. I was just kind of curious about it, and I think she said her dad had commissioned it for a wedding gift for her mother. So again, a large one that size has to have some kind of story behind it. You got to go with it. And then another, obviously Jim Fitch is instrumental, all the other guys, but Dave Folds, you were telling me earlier, was the first to bring the Highwayman paintings outside of Florida. He was. That was 1997 at the Atlanta Folk Fest. So these were folk artists that were mainly represented. He dealt with folk art as well as Highwayman art. He decided to integrate that into Atlanta area. So Hezekiah Baker was represented, Johnny Daniels, and Marianne Carroll at that show. And Gene Tyson, who went on to become an important dealer up in Micanopy, she got introduced to the Highwayman art through Dave Folds in that 1997 event. And there was a big community. I think you were talking about some of the early dealers really did a lot of business together and worked together, set up shows together, had a nice early community of people that were really enamored with this story, right? They did. Dave shared that with me recently, that there wasn't a lot of competitiveness, that they would all hang out together, LeBlanc, John Phillips, and Dave Folds. And recently, Dave Folds was nice enough. He's elderly at this point. He just relocated. He was getting rid of some things. I bought some off of eBay. But then I said, do you have anything else? And he said, well, I have these VHS tapes that I don't really want. I said, well, don't throw them out. Save them and we can meet. And when we met, and he has an interview with Sam Newton from 1995. Really cool. That's on video, yeah. Zenobia Jefferson, Gladys Bennett, Alfred Hare's sister, Johnny Daniels, George Buckner, Marianne Carroll, and Hezekiah Baker, and Curtis Arnett. So he gave me 7 important interviews that he did in 1995. So this was right after the Highwayman name came out. Sam at that point was kind of okay with it. And later on, he got more upset about the name, but he was fine with it in the 95 interview. It's a lot of mixed feelings on the Highwayman moniker, especially with Sam. But, going with that, it's interesting too, because in the community, right? Like people want that Highwayman name attached to those 26 artists, and there were some loose knit artists that were kind of painting and in the circles there, but weren't really considered Highwaymen. So the list is a little bit debatable. We had just talked about Jim Fitch didn't really consider Robert Butler even a Highwayman artist.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct. He was over in the Okeechobee area originally, and they had a close relationship for many years. But in some of the letters I found where he was communicating with Gary Monroe, he didn't consider him a highwayman at that point.
Yeah, and I guess, if you ask me, I don't think I would really consider Robert Butler a highwayman artist. Sometimes
he did go on the road, though, is what Jim would tell you.
Well, that is
Similar.
a key component, you know. But you don't really see beach scenes and a lot of palm trees like Robert Bud's. It was more
they're rare.
Robert Butler, excuse me, more of the backwoods scenes. And even his art style was much different. Previously we talked about some of the early unsigned paintings, and it could be hard to differentiate who did what. I could narrow down maybe a handful of artists, but I've seen some unsigned paintings that I've asked multiple people, and you could have 5 opinions on an artist. They were kind of piggyback off each other and looking at their styles and stuff. And with the early supporters and contributors, another name that's very important to the Highwayman story, obviously Backus, which we'll talk about, but Zenobia Jefferson.
Correct.
Was really important. She taught some of the students, some of the artists as students from the Fort Pierce School.
Yep, Lincoln Park
Park Academy, yep. And she had recognized Alfred Hare's, talent at a young age.
She did. You want to talk about the truth behind how she introduced him to Backus?
Yeah,
okay.
Of course.
So there were 2 interviews that Zenobia did. One with Julie D'Amico for the first Highwayman documentary was in 2000, and she was interviewed for that, and she describes that Alfred at that point, probably about 11th grade, was cutting class frequently to go watch an artist by the name of Harold Newton paint down in Fort Pierce, Avenue D area. She told the same interview to Dave Folds in 95, so she's consistent. And basically, eventually, it was so repetitive that the mom found out. The school called, said, Alfred's not going to class. And at that point, she went to Zenobia, and Zenobia said, okay, he's interested in art, obviously. He's cutting class to go watch Harold. We'll hook him up with Mr. Backus, or try to. And she succeeded in making that introduction.
And there's actually a lot of talks about Alfred Hare being the only one that took lessons with Beanie Backus, but Harold Newton was essentially taking lessons, or a pupil, right, as your timeline had put together.
What happened with the books is none of the authors really did a deep dive into archival newspaper articles that could easily be found. You'd have to go to a library in the late 90s, but by 99, 2000, you could do it from home on a computer. So I've collected many articles over the years. My grandmother lived in Polk County, so we met Butler in 76. She was a citrus grove owner, so they would have annual meetings for the owners. Mr. Butler was there. She was a retired art teacher. She loved to chat with him about art.
I'm sure. Yeah.
So over the many years that we would meet him at those events, gradually you learn a little bit more about other artists. He was close with Curtis Arnett and Hezekiah Baker. He spoke of Harold Newton, Alfred, who gotten killed earlier. But anyway, so you started to hear the history. And in terms of the newspaper articles, she started saving them for me back then. And then as I started to dig into the history more, I found articles with Harold and Mr. Backus exhibiting at art shows in 54. I think it was February of 54 and then March of 54. One was in Fort Pierce and then one was in Vero Beach. So, and he was described in the newspaper as another Backus pupil, in addition to Thomas Fresh, was Harold Newton. So Harold got into 3 shows with Mr. Backus in 54 and 55. So the paper described him as a pupil of Backus. Harold did an interview in 59 with the Miami Herald and pretty much said, I didn't really get successful at this until I met Mr. Backus and had the opportunity to observe him painting. Now, whether that's classified as a lesson or not, I guess you could argue it, but I would argue that he had lessons with Mr. Backus as well as Alfred, and then Sam Newton, as you know, in the interview with Dave Folds, he clearly says that, when they asked him what he thought of Mr. Backus, he said he was a great guy. When I would go down to visit him, he'd immediately say, grab a canvas, come paint with me. He loved to hear Sam sing, actually. Backus was known to listen to Duke Ellington and jazz music.
Yeah.
And Sam has a baritone voice. So
Sam has some pipes on him,
he
huh?
does.
Yeah.
He does.
He can sing and paint, yeah.
So, and Sam said that, Harold, Alfred, and himself got to paint with Backus, yeah.
And, with that introduction, we wanted to move into one of our examples of one of those early paintings that Harold had. And a lot of people know this and some people don't, but when Harold first started painting, he did religious scenes. I'm not sure there's any information out there, like an article or whatnot, because mainly it's the Florida scapes. But from what we understand, it was religious scenes on like velvet.
Correct. And there is an article that I'll bring up. There was an article in '58. Harold moved to Sarasota. So he was featured in 2 feature articles in the Sarasota Bradenton paper that I found. And in one of them, they talk about him still selling religious paintings in '58. So it's a little bit of a myth that he stopped immediately doing. I mean, the Newtons are a very religious family. If that's a deep spiritual core, even though he wants to sell paintings, it sounds like he was still painting some religious paintings into the late '50s.
And Backus basically had said to him, you're going to have a lot easier time because you have a more broad audience
with landscapes.
Yeah, exactly, with landscapes. And so the early paintings, and this actually was Backus too, was a lot of palette knife. There's a lot of paint on the canvases or canvas boards. And the palette knife was a really early instrumental part of a lot of the artist's works. As we see that painting there, that's the 1950s Harold. Really heavy palette knife. And a lot of those paintings really resemble Backus. I mean, you could certainly see the influence. And we've also heard from Jim Fitch and Willie Daniels and Sam Newton about Harold's later works, the 1980s, Masonite, and even early 90s. And there's another example of, I mean, it's almost like a photograph, right? It looks like
beautiful.
We're standing on the beach. Yeah, that was a painting we sold recently. Incredible. It was purchased right from an attorney. Harold Newton came to his office, car loaded up with paintings, and that was one that was purchased in the 80s. And I mean, the painting really speaks for itself. You can almost hear the waves crashing, and you can smell the salt air. And so just the transition from Harold was incredible. A lot of these artists, as you mentioned, the early paintings are kind of hard to differentiate. And then a lot of artists kind of develop their own style. And that story is very promising for artists that were mainly self-taught, maybe a little bit of influence, but how incredible their art became. One of my favorite artists is Sam Newton. And even there's some Upson board paintings that are incredible. The colors are phenomenal. And then you have the 80s Masonite paintings from Sam. And then I think some of his best works are those 90s dated paintings, from 91 to 94 or something like that.
I would agree. In the 80s, the lawyer that had that painting was a Melbourne lawyer, and Harold was living in Palm Bay from about 82 up until he had his stroke, and after he had his stroke, went to live with a family in Gifford. But Harold was in Brevard County in Palm Bay, and then Sam was up in Cocoa then. So Harold and Sam painted a lot together in the mid to late 80s until he had his stroke in 93. So you wonder, did all that opportunity to work with Harold maybe enhance his skill level, that it kind of peaked in the early 90s, where he just did absolutely stunning paintings.
A lot of parallels between the two artists, yeah.
Absolutely.
Do we know where Lem was at that time? That's the third brother that was a highwayman.
He was in Brevard for a while, but I think he eventually went back to Georgia and then possibly Texas.
Yeah, and Lemuel Newton's another one that very mixed palette, but you know, a good artist. And when he took his time, it was really apparent. But I've seen some Lem Newton paintings, which are really incredible. All three Newton brothers were very talented.
Absolutely.
Especially in the sense that maybe they had the opportunity really to paint and work together and help with, you know, taking your time and kind of developing styles and skills, or as they would visit Bacchus. I know a gentleman that took lessons with Bacchus, and you know, Bacchus, it was later in his career in the 80s, but he said as Bacchus wouldn't give him direct tips, he'd kind of, you know, and kind of correct him on when he was painting, and he's looking at Bacchus, and Bacchus is kind of like, no, that's not how the lighting goes, or, you know, or even when you look at a palm tree, I mean, I think the Natasha Bacchus book was talking about the color of that, but even a palm can be 5 different colors. You know, you think it's just green, but you have the light reflecting off it, you can have the little dead parts of it, so there's a lot of color variations you can interpret just from small parts of a painting, which, again, like when you talk about Jim Fitch and Willie Daniels and Robert Butler and some of these artists, they highlight some of those eras of the artists where they were really painting their best skills, which, speaking about folk art and fine art, I think the Highwaymen cross, you know, both those boxes. They check both those boxes with being folk art, self-taught, and then they really dip into the fine art category, as Bacchus was a fine artist. And you're looking at some of the Highwaymen, some of their art is very fine art. It's very well done. It's phenomenal. There's a funny part of their sales method too in calling them Highwaymen. And in that interview, Sam was talking about getting in a little bit of trouble with the law when he was selling paintings.
He did. He did. That was, I think that was in about 69 or 1970. And Sam said he was living in the Delray Beach area then. And he had good luck selling them in Palm Beach County.
A lot of people down there.
Yep, a lot of wealthy people too. It's a smart place to do it.
No kidding, yeah. So Sam's selling paintings, and a cop pulls him over.
He does.
And
I think a store owner spotted him walking up the sidewalk with paintings in his hand, and Sam believed that she called in the complaint, and the police intervened and said, you know, we've arrested you before. And Sam said, no, it wasn't me.
Yeah.
You got it confused. Possibly it was James Gibson that was regularly also selling down there. But yeah, they took him in and said, you know, okay, we'll take you back to your car, once they found out that it wasn't Sam that had been arrested before.
They checked his ID or whatever, right?
Checked his ID, took him back to his van and said, just don't come back here again.
Which is funny, right? I mean, those guys were hustling. The fact that they were out there promoting paintings and selling paintings, I mean, they were working hard to do that and making a good living doing that. And that story with Sam is interesting, that, you know, he was telling us that in that interview with Dave Folds, which, I mean, when Dave Folds recorded that and had that information out there, it's really amazing to have that time frame, especially because now, as we get so much excitement behind the Highwaymen and the artists, unfortunately, we're not left with a lot of the art. There's 2 living now. So a lot of these stories are lost with the artist, and even, you know, from the 50s and 60s, even if you interviewed some of those artists today, I mean, their memory would probably be a little bit different from what they recollect from that. I mean, sometimes I forget, like 5 years ago, how stories transpired and stuff.
It was a long interview too. It was almost 2 hours that they interviewed Sam. And you want to talk about some of the famous people from the Palm Beach area that he sold to?
Yeah, I do. Yeah. He had a few name drops in that one.
He did. So Jackie Gleason was one of his customers, the comedian, and then Jack Nicklaus, the golfer.
That's right, yeah.
And I talked to Sam after I saw the interview. I was like, hey, I heard you sold to Jackie Gleason. Was it a secretary you sold to? He said, no, I met Mr. Gleason. And I said, did he buy one painting? He said, no, I would show him a line of paintings, and he took them all.
Yeah.
I said, well, good for you. And then Nicholas was a regular buyer of his art also.
That's really cool. Yeah.
Yeah.
And with that part of Sam going down there and being in Palm Beach and getting pulled over and in trouble, it was interesting because then there was an interview with Robert Butler where he stated he would load up his car with paintings. He had $10 in his wallet, so he said, I needed to sell paintings, right? I needed gas, I needed to get home. So there was a lot of motivation behind him to sell some paintings. And he had said that on the first place he stopped at, I don't recall if it was a doctor's office or attorney's office, whatever, he walks in and what does he see? Highwayman art. So Robert Butler kind of was like, Sam, like somebody has already been here, right? Someone's already gone and sold these paintings. And so Robert Butler was like, oh man, like, am I going to resell them paintings that they already bought, Florida paintings? So it was kind of funny that both Sam and Robert Butler had stories of them going to what they thought was uncharted territory, and it had already been visited by a Highwayman artist that had sold a lot, and it could have been Al Black too, as far as he was such a big salesman, for the Highwayman art that maybe Robert Butler was going behind Al Black, which Al Black was such a great salesman. He was selling stuff left and right. So
yeah, I mean, they got really all over the East Coast, Central Florida, but also on the West Coast. I found after Harold moved from Sarasota to Fort Pierce in '59, in '60, a furniture store in Sarasota was advertising a Harold Newton exhibit that they were having, where you could see his paintings, buy them. And that was interesting. And there were several other, as early as 1954, there were businesses in Vero Beach that were hosting Harold Newton exhibits. Mm-hmm. So we kind of hear that, well, they weren't allowed to sell at galleries, and there weren't a lot of art galleries in the 50s or 60s in Florida, really.
Yeah.
But there were a lot of businesses that were eager to get Harold Newton to sell his paintings. So some of that, I think, is a little bit of a myth.
For sure, yeah. And that's a great point. There's some people saying, well, they were black artists and they couldn't sell in galleries. And there's probably some truth behind that. But the reality was in Florida back then, it wasn't like all these galleries were like, hey, there's a gallery every street corner. It was hard. And I even read about, Bacchus would frequent down in West Palm to even sell some of his artwork. So
correct.
Here's a different artist had kind of the same mindset, is that, Fort Pierce isn't, I mean, granted, he was known in Fort Pierce, but I'm going to have to go outside the area to market these paintings and sell them. Mm-hmm. The Buckner brothers went down to Miami at some point, which is a whole nother story, but they were another one that, went out of the realm and opened their own gallery.
They also were recognized in the Florida papers in 1971, I believe, did a beautiful Everglades scene that a lawyer in Miami bought and showed it to a friend who was a Supreme Court judge in Florida. They loved the painting, so they commissioned one from him. And my understanding is that the Buckners gifted it to the Florida Supreme Court, so they were recognized for this gift in 1970 or 71.
Yeah, which is really cool.
Interesting.
Breaks down all those barriers that people were very receptive to the art.
Alfred Hare in 66 or 7, I found an advertisement. Guess who he exhibited with? Salvador Dali.
So, interesting. Yeah.
At I think it was in Fort Lauderdale area.
Yeah.
So.
And I'm not sure. I mean, I know there's a ton of money behind Dali paintings, but I'm not sure if that, when that really took off. Right. When he was a living artist, was he really successful? Was the money there? Because it seems like a lot of artists don't find that success until either later in life, or maybe they're represented early on and they have the right people giving their art the recognition it deserves. One of the we have a lot to talk about today, but one of the really great things I want to talk to you about while you're here is the Roy McClendon Northern painting you have.
Okay.
Sometimes we see these unusual paintings and we don't always have the stories behind them, but you were able to get your hands on a really interesting story with this painting. So tell us a little bit about it.
That one, interestingly, was up in the Ugali area, House on the River. And I got a double-sided Moran and Sam Newton at the same estate sale, so I got lucky.
That's a great painting,
I brought my son to the sale. I expected another dealer to come in, and I said, when so-and-so shows up, I want you to distract him so I can go in and get these two paintings. So my son, the dealer didn't show up, so I told my son, I said, go over to that scene. I knew it was a McClendon, and it had 145. I said, go see what they want. And he said, 145. I said, that can't be. Go back and check your decimal. He was young then. And he went back. He said, Dad, it's 145. So I said, well, go get it. So he grabbed it, got that for 145. I showed it to Mr. McClendon, and he said that he right away said, oh, that was from a Robert Woods painting that I saw in Life magazine in the 60s. He said he really liked the Northeast. He used to pick, and as a migrant worker, loved Pennsylvania, New Jersey, those areas. But, that's what influenced him. It was a Robert Woods picture.
It's a great painting, and there's a lot of detail behind it. I always appreciated McClendon's art because there's a lot of depth in his art. They're unique paintings. I mean, McClendon made his whole career out of painting. But again, to have a scene outside of Florida and how well it's done, and it's got the little McClendon trademark, the broken tree in the middle, the dead tree. Yeah.
But the estate sale owner did not recognize it as a highwayman at all.
Yeah.
So I got lucky.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's nice to hear it from Roy McClendon directly as to how Robert Woods influenced him, how much he appreciated the Northeast. And
yeah, definitely. Yeah, there's supposedly some. I know Livingston Roberts was in New York for a little while. Were there paintings of his up north that we know of, or?
I've seen some that were northern scenes that probably came from that period.
Yeah. Ray had said at some point Roy McClendon had moved up to Pennsylvania for a little while and had maybe painted some scenes up there too, which they're probably in existence somewhere out there. Maybe we'll come across them at some point. But yeah, if McClendon was up there, I think he'd probably have a hard time selling palm trees in Pennsylvania. So
yeah. What he did with that scene that you just saw is he also did a version that looked like spring, where you see flowers along the river.
Oh, okay, yeah.
And then he did a winter scene of it. So he did a couple of different seasons for that scene.
Yeah. It'd be cool to have like 4 seasons, right?
It would be. I know an artist who has 2 other ones of the same scene. He's got the spring. I think it's either winter or summer.
Yeah. I don't think I've ever seen a snow scene by the Highwaymen artists.
Sam did a scene with white trees.
Oh, yeah. That's interesting.
Yeah.
Maybe it was that weird snowstorm in Tallahassee in the 70s, whenever that was.
Maybe.
Yeah.
It may be.
Well, there's so much more to talk about, and there's a lot today, but this was kind of our first introduction to the Highwaymen and some of the timeline and things we're talking about. I think we might have to do this again at some point, because we do have
be more than happy to.
A lot more to talk about. But we have a lot of stories with some of the other paintings that we will talk about in the future. But for today, I think we're going to wrap up our conversation a little bit. We'll leave it at the McClendon painting. If you're watching and have an unusual Highwayman painting with a story, we'd love to see photos and stories or information on it, and maybe we could talk about that at some point. And Jim, thank you so much for joining me today. It's been a pleasure, and I always enjoy talking to you about Highwaymen stuff.
Appreciate it.
And then we'll have more for you.
Okay.